Hello and welcome to episode 459 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, we are back in the studio. How you doing?
We are back, and as I mentioned last week, it is the 10th anniversary has passed this week of me being on Money to the Masses, which was great because I wanted to mention it again because I wanted to thank all those people who wrote in with messages, because after 10 years of doing this full time, it was a big anniversary and it was really nice to have those messages, particularly Jeff. I'll mention Jeff, who sent in a message which I shared with the whole team. Actually, it was an email that mentioned a story of somebody throwing starfish back into the sea, so you can Google that. It's one I'd not heard, so thank you, Jeff. You've been a long-term supporter of Money to the Masses actually, and 80/20 investor, so I thought I'd just give you a quick mention. But Andy, it's been another good week, busy week at Money to the Masses, and we've got quite a bit to get through on the show this week. Don't forget, if you haven't sent in a review recently, then please make sure you do. 5 stars is what we want, and you could get a Money to the Masses mug. And the other thing I want to mention before we start the show properly is don't forget to support the show. So if you want this show to continue as it does, you want a weekly show, then do make sure you support the podcast, moneytothemasses.com/podcast. On that page, you'll find a whole host of things that you can do to support the show, from joining the newsletter, which you will get each week with all the news stories of the week, the key ones. That comes out on Sunday at 10 a.m. and also there are lots of deals and offers on there, some of them exclusive to Money to the Masses members, covering all sorts of things from insurance to investment products that you can utilize, and we may get a small payment for you taking out a product via our affiliate link. So it's just the sort of way that all the other websites you know out there are funded, like Money Saving Expert, for example. So it's a way of you supporting the show and thanking us for all the work we do in providing everything at Money to the Masses.
And also don't forget that we are recording this show this week on YouTube, so you can watch us in person if you want to. The video will go up a little later in the week than when the audio podcast comes out, and you can use that to put your questions and comments about the show. You could maybe even comment about the fact that we're both wearing shorts this week, but unfortunately you can't actually see that because the video sort of shows.
I'm not sure whether that's a good or bad thing, Andy. It depends on your view.
The weather is getting nicer, but let's get on with this week's podcast. What have we got coming up on the show?
So 3 pieces this week. So the first piece is an investment piece that's inspired by a question in our Facebook group. So we've got our Facebook community. Don't forget to go and join it if you've not already. Facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. So in that group, you can ask questions of other members, and somebody put in there, have we covered buybacks on the podcast? And if not, would we be able to? So I put a response on there saying, listen out for a future episode. I will cover it, because it was something that we had talked about in the office, because obviously there had been a number of share buybacks announced, one of them being Apple, who announced that they're going to perform a share buyback. So what is a share buyback? How does it work? And how does it impact people who invest in the company? And can you potentially benefit from them? The other piece is actually inspired by a review that we received. So recent weeks, I read out a review from a member that mentioned about their child had actually listened to the show and started to put in action some of the tips and advice that we'd given, and they actually had quite a nice sum already invested. And from that, I received an email that described what that person had been doing and how they'd actually enabled their child to get onto the investing ladder, as it were. So what I wanted to do was a piece on how parents can help their children. So we're talking about young children and their adult children, but in ways that are quite subtle. It doesn't mean you've got to have lots of money to be able to help them. Ways you could do things that could give them a bit of a foot up, a leg up in life. And the third piece I want to do is about energy. Now, this month marks an important point in the calendar for everybody with regards to their direct debits and their energy bills. You want to listen to that at the end of the podcast.
Okay, so let's get on with this week's show then. The first piece, we're going to be talking about share buybacks.
Yes, so this, as I mentioned earlier, was inspired by a question in our Facebook group. And the question was, what are share buybacks? How do they work? So I wanted to do a piece on share buybacks. And you may have heard the word recently because Apple announced in their latest earnings results that they are going to be carrying out a share buyback. So understandably, there'll be a lot of people thinking, well, what is it? Because usually when it's been announced that there will be a share buyback, the share price of that company goes up. So a share buyback is where a public listed company, so a company that you can buy the shares of openly on the stock exchange, decides that they are going to go and buy back their shares, and they will buy them from the open market usually. So what they will do is they could be like Apple, that will have billions of dollars of cash available to invest in whatever it may be they want to do in the company, so for the future profits of the company, but they may instead decide to use that money to buy back their own shares. So it can happen a number of ways. It can be that existing shareholders can be offered to have their shares bought back from them, so they would actually effectively end up cashing out. But what's more likely is that they go out into the open market and then buy back a certain amount of shares. Now, the way they might announce the buyback is by saying they're going to announce so many billions pounds worth of shares being bought back. So in the case of Apple recently, they announced that they were going to buy $110 billion worth of their own shares back. HSBC actually announced a buyback recently, and theirs was 3 billion in size. So they might announce the amount of money they're going to use to buy shares back. They could announce the number of shares they're going to buy or the percentage of outstanding shares out there in the marketplace that they're going to buy. So in the case of Apple, it's 110 billion pounds they're going to put towards share buybacks. Now, they will go out into the market over time and actually buy those shares. So why would they do that? What is the point? Now, the way you got to think about it is, if you're a company like Apple and you have lots of money that may be on your balance sheet and you could do something with that, you might look to invest it in. And one way you could sit there and think that if a company decides to buy its own shares, then what it's really saying in one way is that the best investment opportunity out there is actually to buy its own shares and invest in itself, which on a very basic level might be something that you would deem as quite bullish or something very optimistic by the management of that company, to say that they actually think the future for the company is very bright. Because don't forget, they obviously know more about the future of the company, where the direction it's going to go, maybe its earnings potential, than you do as an investor. So that is one thing. And so the idea generally is that a buyback is positive for a share price. And you may see when there's been an announcement of a share buyback that the share price leaps. And that is exactly what happened in the case of Apple recently. So what happens is the company will go out and buy shares from the market. So if you think about it, there is a limited supply of shares in any given company out there. So Apple will go out and it will actually buy 110 billion pounds worth of shares. And so what it will do is it will reduce the pool of shares that are out there for the public to own. And so what that does in turn is that actually increases certain valuation metrics. So when you look at things about earnings per share, so when you talk about the valuation of a company, you might look at the earnings per share. And that means that you look at the net income of the company and you therefore divide it by the outstanding shares that are out there. Those earnings per share will actually go up, because you think about the earnings divided by the number of outstanding shares. Well, that figure will go up because there will be less shares. So that as a valuation metric is something that's positive. And it's all about trying to return value back to the shareholders. And so by buying back shares, it will probably cause more investors to be attracted to that particular stock. So while the earnings per share may go up, you don't need to really understand this, but another valuation metric, which is the PE ratio, so it's the price to earnings, that goes down, because obviously the price of the earnings per share, when you look at it, it's a measurement where you divide one by the other. That actually reduces. It might attract a few investors. The point is that generally it's seen, conventional wisdom, that it drives up the value of the stock because there are less of them out there, and that in turn boosts the value of the shares that people hold. So the share price will go up. So if you're an existing investor, you'll see your value of your stock that you've got go up, and that is a positive in one way, because you could argue, why don't you just give a dividend back to the shareholders? They could do that, but of course that is taxable. Whereas if they do a share buyback, what they've also done there is they've increased the value, hopefully, of the shares for the existing shareholders. But that is obviously on paper, and there is no taxation of that at the point that they do it. It also gives them some flexibility, because don't forget, if they announce a buyback and it has some positive value for existing shareholders, if they announce a dividend instead, then going forward, they're going to have to bear that in mind when they get to future potential dividend announcements. Because if they announce a dividend, then people are going to start to base an expectation on the next dividend based on what's already gone before. So it can give them greater flexibility. So that might be one reason why they decide to do a buyback rather than declare a dividend. So there's that tax efficiency, but there's also that flexibility. But also they might buy shares back because they could then potentially use them as incentives for employees. So in some kind of incentivization scheme, but it doesn't dilute the value of existing shareholders' shares. So if you sit there and think, if instead they decided to produce a scheme where they were rewarding employees, they effectively have to create new shares. Well, that would dilute the holdings of the existing shareholders out there. So this can be a way of them buying back shares and using it to reward employees, and in particular management. And there are certain criticisms about that because it can mean it's not always quite clear what's going on internally with these things. I'm talking about for external investors looking inward. So it also can be beneficial because when they do a share buyback, it could effectively take them out of circulation and reduce the number of shares in existence, or it can keep them. But the decision ultimately can help them as well prevent a takeover, because what they can do is they can control the stake of maybe somebody external who could end up trying to take a controlling stake in the company. So that might be a particular reason why they might do a share buyback. But ultimately, the reason they do share buybacks, as I mentioned, is to provide value for shareholders. The pros I've pretty much already mentioned as well. Now, there are some downsides because it can stifle growth. You've got to think that they are taking money from a business and they're using it to buy back their shares, and that money theoretically could have been used to grow other opportunities. So the business itself could have grown or benefited from that cash. Now, that in turn could, if it's viewed negatively, could see the share price fall despite a share buyback. So it's all about perception. So share buybacks generally are seen as positive, but I've read quite a few papers when I was researching this part of the podcast, and it's not a given that share buybacks are necessarily a positive for shareholders in the long run and for companies. But ultimately, they are generally, as a conventional wisdom, deemed as a positive, at least in the short term. The one thing where they are a negative is because if you have lots of cash in a company and therefore you're using that to fund a share buyback, that's one thing. But you can actually fund a share buyback by using debt. And therefore, what you would be doing is saddling a company with a large amount of debt. And that therefore can be very negative. And that's where you're more likely to see that negative reaction from a share price perspective. But one thing to point out when we're talking about some of these valuation metrics, earnings per share in particular, that by carrying out a share buyback, they will increase that EPS number. But that does therefore make the company look like it's performing better than it perhaps is. It can cloud the comparisons, especially historically, because the earnings number is going to be unchanged, but the number of outstanding shares has changed. And so by the earnings per share going up, then if you just looked at that in isolation, then that doesn't give you the full picture. So it's something to bear in mind. So as an individual investor who's already in a company, like maybe it was Apple, and you had holdings with them, had shares, then the announcement of a buyback can be positive. If you aren't invested, then the question is, can you benefit by then buying into the shares? Well, the reality is once the announcement's made, then the reaction on the share price is normally very quick. And then, of course, the inaction or the facilitation of the buyback itself will take time, but the likelihood is that you've missed the boat when it comes to the initial reaction when you see the stock price jump, as you did with Apple. Actually, that's already gone because it happened at the announcement. So it's something that is interesting. It's something to keep an eye out for. We'll probably see more of it in the future. There's been a number of them, but the thing to bear in mind is that the cash balances are generally quite positive for share prices because they are a company with almost like a war chest. So sometimes it can be a negative or seen as a negative when they remove that money, because it can then start to affect the valuation of that company as well. So it's a very simple idea, but it does have implications for existing shareholders. But generally speaking, if you hear about a stock buyback of a company that you already invest in, then it's generally going to be positive news for the stock price.
So obviously that's interesting news this week with Apple. Is there potentially an opposite thing that happens where companies effectively create more shares?
Yeah, so we have covered it on the podcast. We'll put a link to it in the notes, but something called a stock split, where they will create more shares, but the whole total market cap. So if you took the value of all the shares in existence remains the same. So they might split the number of stocks and basically multiply it by 2. So every share becomes 2. And the reason they might do that is because where you get a company that's very successful, you get the value of their shares become so large. I mean, in the world of fractional shares, it's not so much of an issue, but in the world where you want to own a share and the share price becomes hundreds or if not thousands of dollars, then by doing a stock split, it then theoretically enables smaller investors to access those shares. So we have covered that on the podcast, as you say, Andy, in the past, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. And this piece was inspired by a listener who got in touch to share with us a way in which they were able to help a family member reach a 6-figure sum by helping them to invest. Damien, it's an interesting piece, this.
Yeah, so this was a result of a review actually that we received in a subsequent conversation via email. And the person said that they had helped their child, who was an adult, to get a 6-figure sum invested. And they were obviously pleased about that. But they mentioned how they did that is the child lives at home with them, but they allow them to live rent-free in their house on the proviso that they invest 50% of their salary. And that is how they've been able to build this sizable investment pot. And I looked at that and I started talking to the rest of the team, and I liked the idea. And it was thinking about things slightly differently, because obviously for that person, it didn't cost them anything notionally to allow their child to live at home now that they were an adult. But there was this proviso they had to invest, in this case it was 50%, but any portion of their salary into some kind of investment. And they therefore are set up for a hopefully positive and bright future financially. So this got me thinking about alternative ways to help children, because we've talked about the Millionaire podcast before. So how to make your child a millionaire by starting off very small. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, because you can do that from when they're very small, and you can end up putting away as little as about sort of £15-20 a month, and it can really snowball. And by the time they end up being old and grey, they can inevitably be millionaires by the power of compounding. But I wanted to look at it in a slightly different way, because not everybody has money that they can help their children with or give them. And so we were starting to think about, well, were there other ways? So taking this example here where the person had done 50% of their salary had to go into investments, well, you can vary that. It could be a much smaller amount, but just getting them into the habit of investing. Now, one of the discussions came about in the office, which was, well, rather than forcing them, or agreeing, I should say, to put money away and start investing, well, you could actually charge them a rent. But you actually take that rent and you invest it, or you put it into a savings account. And then at a future point when they are looking to move on or whatever it may be, you can then present them with that. Now, that is an alternative method, because then you can decide whether you want to give it to them or not. But the one thing I did like about the former option, which was that they were encouraged to invest themselves, they've actually explored and learned to invest in a sensible way. Whereas if you do it for them, then when you give them the money back, I think less has been learned, and actually they're less likely to carry on and invest because they haven't actually invested themselves. They've not earned anything.
Yeah, and I think without that knowledge of knowing that they're putting their own money away and investing for the future, it maybe seem more of a gift, if you like, at the end, a bit of a Brucey bonus. And so there isn't that sort of like investing knowledge, like you say.
Yeah, and so I think that's the important bit. That's why I quite like it. So I'm going to carry on and run through some ideas. There's a range of things I'm going to mention. I'm not going to go into each in detail. It's just really to spark ideas, and people can go and find more information via the links that we're going to give. And some of these are things I know that people have done. There are some in here that some people might not almost ethically agree with. And if you have any ideas that I don't mention, because there's going to be lots of them out there, then please put them in the Money to Masses group or email them in, because I'm intrigued and it's a discussion point. Now, one of them that I know that going to university is incredibly expensive, and people will take out student loans. And I know the system has always been that it's been seen as more of a contribution, that you end up not having to repay all of the loans, and things have changed in recent years, and we've done a podcast on that. But the reality is that students can end up being or leaving university and having a lot of debt. And that can put some people off, but there's also that burden that carries on through a large portion of their working life. Now, one idea that I know has happened and people have done it, and it said it's worked successfully, was where where somebody wanted to put their children to university, and they actually happened to have 2 children going at the same time through university, and they didn't want them to have that burden but wanted them to have the experience. So the agreement was that the children would take out their student loans but then would give them directly to the parent, because they used it as a cheap way of taking out a loan to put their children through university. So the parent took the money, the children were then given a regular allowance that was enough for them to live at university and go out and have fun, but it was streamlined. So it kind of taught them a bit of budgeting. There is an argument whether there was an element of controlling that, and some people might not like it, but it does start to make people budget because they don't have all their money at once. I can tell you now, when I went to university, which I know it was quite a while ago, but as soon as everybody got all their grants in those days or their loans, they'd go out and just kit their rooms out with the most expensive gear and then be broke within about a term. But the deal on this arrangement was that when it came to the point they left university, that the parent would make the repayments, and so they would transfer the money to them and repay their debt, because they were still in their working life too. So the person will leave with a debt from university, so the students might leave with a debt, but theoretically they don't have one, because the parents have said, well, we're actually going to repay the debt for you. So whatever your monthly repayments are, I'm going to physically give you that for the time until you've repaid that debt, because they may be able to afford it. So that is an alternative way of funding university via loans that would be perhaps cheaper than what you could get as a personal loan, and also sizable loans, because you might not necessarily be able to get a loan of sufficient size to put your children through university, but also a way that children go to university and not be saddled with the debt when they came out. It won't work for everybody, but it did work for the people who used it, and then they weren't saddled with that debt, and they were able to start their working life without that feeling of actually having to repay their student debt. So that is another way. Other ideas I'm going to chuck out there, roundups. So this was another idea that came up in the office. There are many ways you can use roundups. Lots of the digital banks now allow you to spend on your cards, for example, and then they round up your spending to the nearest pound and they put it into a savings account. You can even use things like Moneybox, which enable you to invest the money. You could use that principle from young and start to put that money aside. So you are spending a bit more than you would do normally, but you are just rounding up the pence to the pounds and therefore using that to put it aside. So this is, again, doing something slightly differently, but it's enabling you to help your children. There is the idea of perhaps cashback cards. So let's say you've got a cashback credit card and in a year you may earn £100, £200 cashback, whatever that may be. You could set that aside. So you are just carrying out your spending and you are earning cashback, and you could just use that as money that you never had and put it aside for their future use. You could invest it, for example. I know there are cashback apps that you're fond of, Andy, that you use regularly. There's a link to one of them on the Money to Masses support page, moneytomasses.com/podcast, where you can download an app that gives you cashback on pretty much most retailers that I come across in the high street. And even the other day, they're offering a sort of a 4% kicker on with Tesco, I think.
Tesco and Amazon. And I'm pleased to say, Damien, I checked last night my cashback app. Since November, I've earned over £120 cashback just via that app. And I also have a cashback credit card where I do my normal, regular, everyday spend. So it's significant. It does add up. It really does.
So that is another way you could potentially, you're not changing what you do, but you are just spending in a different way that you could use that money that could be put towards something like that millionaire junior ISA concept that we talked about in that podcast. The other one, now this is slightly controversial, okay? So this is the one that I've heard people mention in the past where they might be getting a child benefit or they may be elderly and getting a winter fuel allowance. Now there are plenty of people out there who get these benefits and they may not need them for the use that they were intended. Now, let's not pretend that everybody who receives child benefit is spending every penny of that on their children. I know it goes into the round of their finances, and there are people out there who have to spend every penny on their child or children. And equally, people have the winter fuel allowance. There are plenty of people who need that money to pay their fuel bills, but there are also people out there, because it's not means tested at the moment, who get that and they get their winter fuel allowance and they may spend most of the winter on a cruise. The reality is that there is money there that some people could use to put towards their child's future or their grandchild's future that doesn't impact their lifestyle, because it's money in that instance that you don't need. Now, I know there are actually charities that set up for people who have the winter fuel allowance who can donate it to other elderly people who are living in fuel poverty. So that is an option. So this is a way you could use a monetary amount or some extra money to help people that you know and love. There are obviously ideas like equity release. So there are people out there who have a property. They might want to release equity from their property and then use that for means that could include in some way helping their family. That is something you need to seek advice on. So I don't want to labour the point on that. There are other ideas out there, again, you need to seek advice on. There are a lot of people who don't realise that they may inherit money from, let's say, their parents, but they can, within 2 years of the death of the person, if they were the beneficiary of that will, actually use a deed of variation and pass that on to somebody else. And that person didn't have to be named in the will. And so it will pass directly to that person. That could be a child, for example, an adult child in particular, who could then use that money for something else, and it's actually bypassed your estate, so it won't fall into your estate. There's particular elements of tax planning why that's useful, because you may be making gifts yourself, but it does mean it doesn't hit your estate, and therefore that can be very tax efficient. But it's something, again, to seek advice on. But I just want to throw it out there because there could be people who inherit money who don't need it, but they could pass it on to somebody else, and it would be tax efficient to do so. Another idea that came up where we were chatting is about the avoidance of lifestyle creep. So let's say, for example, you had a pay rise at work, or you had some extra income from whatever source that might be. Then what people tend to do is their lifestyle creeps, they start to live to their means. Instead of that, where we've talked about paying yourself first and you might try to pay more into your pension, you could use the extra money and deliberately use it for the benefit of, say, your children, whether that's investing in a junior ISA, whether that's something else entirely. So when you do get a pay rise, you could decide to keep your lifestyle as it is and use that extra money for something else. And a good example of that recently is the extra money that people have had in their pockets from the national insurance cuts. So that again could be a way that you can start to help your children. It's money that you haven't changed your lifestyle, but it's money you didn't have previously. And if you don't need it and you can live without it, then you could use that and help somebody within your family. Now, there are things like guarantor mortgages. Again, that is something that you will need to talk to somebody about and get advice on, but they do enable you to help somebody get on the property ladder. The problem is that as a guarantor, you then have a liability. If they don't pay the mortgage, then obviously your name is on that as a guarantor, and therefore there's going to be a financial burden for you. There are other types of mortgages that exist out there as well, which we've covered on the podcast before. We're going to put links to them in the show notes, but there are mortgages, for example, concessionary mortgages, which enable you to pass your property onto your children. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but they actually enable you to sell your house to your children at a discounted price, which means they'll only pay stamp duty on that discounted price. But it can appeal to people who want to downsize and would have given a discount as a gift. So I don't want to go into detail, but there are things to consider. There is a podcast we're going to link to on that. The other thing, there are types of mortgage products that exist out there. So Barclays have a springboard mortgage, which is a mortgage that enables people to buy property without a deposit. And so it's arranged on a 100% loan to value basis, but there is a helper, which could be you as a parent, where you have to put down 10% of the property purchase price in an account as security. So effectively, you 10% of that property price, you put it in an account and you earn interest on that money, but you can't access it for a set term, which will be a number of years of that mortgage initially. So again, we'll put links in the notes. You can find out more about that. So there are products, and the thing to do is go and look at services like Tembo is a very good one out there that deals with first-time buyers, but go and speak to a mortgage broker, because there are things out there that you can do if you have, say, assets that you don't want to lose, but you may be able to use them to help people on the ladder. There are other ideas. Somebody's talking about, could you help your children with credit? So unfortunately, in this world, having a good credit report is something of benefit. So people were talking about, well, could you help your children's credit report? And now, thinking this through, there isn't a product or anything that can help you do that. But if you teach your children how to use credit wisely, then as a parent, you could, in theory, they have a credit card if they turn 18, but then they start to build a history of repaying credit and using it responsibly, even if it's small amounts, and you end up being the person that ends up helping to pay that, then that will be a positive over the long term. But that is something that's a little bit, I think, kind of fringe. but there is something in that, being able to use credit. But it's one of those things that I never learned how to use credit responsibly when I was young, and obviously I then ended up getting into debt like most people do, and didn't realize the importance of maintaining a balance of certain levels and repaying it and all those kind of things, and clearing debt with savings. So that is something that perhaps could benefit young people if they learn how to do it. Of course, there are ideas that use things like Vinted to sell things like maybe clothes you don't need and get the profits of that, which you can then pass on to children you can help. So you're getting rid of unwanted stuff. There are various different sites out there, things like eBay. There are also things like, from inheritance tax purposes, there are certain allowances that you're allowed to give away each year. That does involve you giving away money, but you may have, for example, grandparents who want to pass on money to children. Don't forget there's a larger inheritance tax allowance for people when they get married. That is something that may be of interest. So most of the other ideas are things where you could not do anything in particular, have to give money, but they could help people. Another one that I want to just throw out there is pensions. So you could have a pension and you may decide to put your children on the nomination of that pension. So the death nomination form, find out from your provider. Someone can inherit your pension without inheritance tax. So it could be tax-free if you die before age 75. They can inherit the money after age 75. Now, what happens there is that they get the money, but they are taxed on the money that's taken out at their marginal rate of income tax. So there are benefits for people if they want to be able to perhaps pass on their pension, then they can do that without inheritance tax directly to people, and it could be their children, and that goes outside of their estate. So that is another benefit, but something to think about. So there's a whole range of things. There are people who are talking about they might help them with their car, but they have to pay the insurance, so therefore they end up learning about the type of car that they'll be able to afford based upon insurance, because people often look at the car first but forget about the other things, and it may make them a more responsible driver because they end up having things like black boxes, etc. It's not quite on the same theme as what I was going for, but they are ideas. So if you have any other ideas as to ways you can help children without fundamentally changing what you do or without gifting them money, because not everybody has spare cash to give people, then please do let us know, because I'm all ears.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. We're going to be talking about energy. Now, May is a key month really when we're talking about energy, and specifically with our direct debits and the amount we pay each month.
Yeah, so this was something that came about. Martin Lewis was talking recently about energy and the usage that people have, and it was quite an interesting chart that he shared. But I mean, everybody understands things in slightly different ways, and I found the takeaway that he was trying to make, I thought there was an alternative version that I thought was quite interesting that we're going to talk about on the podcast. So if you imagine what happens, you've got an energy bill, so it might be dual fuel, so gas and electricity, and let's just use a round number. They've estimated what your usage is going to be, so this is your energy provider I'm talking about, and let's say your monthly direct debit is £200 a month. Now, what will happen is that is the level. In an ideal world, it would stay at £200 a month. And then when you get to the end of the year, you have used exactly 200 times 12, £2,400. And they've estimated it correctly. Now, in reality, it doesn't work like that. But let's just pretend it does now for the ease of understanding. Now, what happens is that you're paying £200 a month. During the winter months, your usage of energy will go up, inevitably, because it's colder, so you need the heating on, and it's darker, so you need to have the lights on more. Then as you start to use more energy, then you are using more than you are paying a month. So you'll be using more than £200 a month. So effectively, you are starting to get into some form of deficit because you're paying less than you actually use. But then as you go into the summer months, you start to use less energy because you don't have the heating on as much, you're not using a tumble dryer if you have one, and you need the lights on less. So there is this cycle you're going through where you end up building credits and deficits throughout the year. So if people have looked at their bills throughout the year, they will notice. So the reason why May is particularly interesting, because this is the point where we are now as you listen to this podcast, where your energy usage is now going to diminish and you're going to start to move into that summer period where your balance, you'll start to move into either more credit or less deficit. And that is a key part of the year. And the reason why I say you could be moving into credit or deficit, because interestingly, where you are in the year matters depending on when you started with your energy provider. So let me explain that. So let's imagine that you took out your energy bill in May. So you pay £200 a month, they've estimated. Now the reality is you're going to start using less and less energy. So you won't be using £200 a month. So there's going to be this bell curve that starts to build, if you imagine, as you go through the months where you have a balance. So a balance starts to build up and you actually start building a bigger and bigger and bigger credit because you're not using £200 worth of energy in a month. And what will happen is about November, you'll hit a level that's the highest credit you'll have with your provider. And roughly speaking, it will be nearly 3 times your monthly direct debit on average, we're talking about, if you started with your energy provider in May. Then from that moment on, you will start using more than £200 a month in energy, and therefore your balance will start to rapidly drop away. And by the time you get through to the following May, you will get back to zero. So you start with zero and you end with zero because you've paid £200 a month times 12, but you've used exactly that. So you can imagine if I was to plot a chart of the months along the x-axis and the balance on the y-axis, you've started at 1 May, it's gone into massive credit, you got to November, that was the peak, and it's roughly about just below 3 times your monthly direct debit, and then it falls away. The problem is that depending on where you started, if you instead started with your energy provider in November, then what happens is you start off paying £200 a month, but you already start using more than that. And so you immediately go into deficit. And in theory, you will always remain in deficit because each month you're using more than you're paying until you get to May. And that's going to be your peak deficit. And then you're going to start using less than you're paying. And then by the time you get to the following November, so that's been 1 year, you'll go back to zero. So people who start in November, generally speaking, will always be in deficit and end up at zero at the end of each year. People who start in May will always be in credit, but they end up at zero in each May. So you can see that where you start your year matters. So when you're sitting in the office and someone says, oh, look at my energy bill or my account, I'm massively in credit, and you're sitting there looking at it going, blimey, I'm massively in debt. You could be both paying the same amount each month, using the same amount of energy, but depending on when you started matters. So if you're a November person, you're always pretty much going to be in a negative, and that negative will get down to probably about 2.5 times your monthly direct debit. At its worst, and that's at May. It's always May because our usage then starts to change, and it will improve as you go back towards the following November. It's the reason I brought it to the podcast, because I want people to go and look at their latest energy bills. So I'm talking about up to date. So you may be billed 6 monthly, but you may be able to see your usage via your smart meter. Work out how much in deficit or credit you are at the moment, but also then look at where you are in terms of your year. Did you start in May? Did you start in November? Or was it somewhere in between? Because that matters. Now, the point is that if you started in November, then at this point, you're going to probably be 2.5 to nearly 3 times your monthly direct debit in deficit, and it will get better. So I don't want people to panic. They can look at that and go, well, that's about where it should be. But everybody else, it should be less than that. Whereas equally, if you're at the point where you start in May every year, then you're going to probably be nearer zero. So the point is that when you want to look at your direct debits now and look at your bill, depending on when you started, you should be no more than 2.5 times your monthly direct debit in deficit, or you should be heading to somewhere where you are towards zero if you started your year in May. So if you have, let's say, 1 to 2 times your monthly direct debit in credit at this point now, then you are likely to have too much money in your account. So if you are paid up to date and you have that much in credit at this point in May, then you probably want to go and speak to your provider to say, look, can you have a look at my direct debits each month? I think I'm paying too much. And then if you are, and they estimate it, then what they'll do is they can, if you ask for them, pay back the amount that you are owed as a lump sum. So, of course, the best thing to do is always look at your actual usage yourself, and then look at your past usage to compare where you think you should be, and then speak to your energy provider. But the one thing that I thought was a really big takeaway was the fact that you shouldn't compare your gas and energy account balance at any given moment with somebody else's, because you don't know when they started with their energy provider, and that has a massive difference on where you should be in deficit or in credit.
Okay, so that's it. We are done for this week's podcast. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. You can contact me. It's Andy at moneytothemasses.com. Please do feedback on the show if you can on the YouTube video that will be going going live just a few days after the audio version of this podcast. And please do also support us in all the other usual ways. Go to our dedicated podcast page. It's moneytothemasses.com/podcast. Do interact with our Facebook group as well. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And Damien, we've got lots going on Instagram
and of course YouTube. So I think that's all that's left, Andy, is for us to say until next time.
Until next time.